This episode is sponsored by Magisterium AI, the world's #1 AI-powered guide to church teaching. Query our knowledge base of over 9,000 magisterial and Catholic theological texts and discover how AI is supercharging access to church teaching.
Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church, the show where we sort through the tidal wave of news, the ever-present, omnipresent, ubiquitous, and never-ending torrent of developments on the Vatican beat in the Pope Francis era, trying to pan for those few nuggets of gold you really need to hold on to and have in your pocket. Here's what we've got for you this week. We begin with the Commission Speaks Out, the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, instituted by Pope Francis in 2014 as his tip of the spear for reform on the child sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church, has weighed in on whether or not artwork by accused abuser Father Marco Rupnik should continue to be displayed in public, specifically on Vatican websites. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Commission's basic answer is no. We will unpack what they said and why it mattered. Second, a quiet milestone. The president of the aforementioned Commission for the Protection of Minors, Boston's Cardinal O'Malley, turned 80 over the weekend. We will explain why it's a kind of landmark moment in the recent history of American Catholicism and kind of what is especially striking about the O'Malley legacy. Third, this week, we've got jousting with the Germans. So once again, this past week, Vatican officials and German bishops had to sit down in a kind of mano-a-mano cage match session to talk about the fallout from the controversial Synodal Way launched by the German Church. In this case, the issues basically had to do with governance and authority. We'll explain what was at stake, what the Vatican said, how the Germans responded, and where things might go from here. Fourth, this week, we've got tut-tut to tattoo. Pope Francis, a pope who 5 years ago said that the church should not be afraid of tattoos, that we should in fact learn from them. In terms of what the youth culture of today is trying to say, has now decided that that benevolence doesn't apparently apply to his own workforce, because he has issued new rules banning visible tattoos and piercings for employees of St. Peter's Basilica, this part of a more comprehensive reform. We'll explain what these new rules consist of and why they are coming out now. Finally, this week, we have a missionary moment. A new report by Crux points to issues of abuse and neglect within the Missionaries of Charity. That's the religious order founded by the beloved Mother Teresa of Calcutta. We will go through what these reports indicate, why they matter, and how things might evolve from this point. All that and more is waiting for you on the show this week. So please, for the love of God, in the name of all that is holy, on bended knee before all the angels and saints, go nowhere. Stay where you are, because we will be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, July 2nd, in the year of our Lord, 2024. We are now officially in the dog days of summer. That is a phrase, by the way, with special relevance in Rome, because it is said of Rome that the only things that move here during the summer are cani e Americani, dogs and Americans. Well, I'm not a dog. I am an American, however, and I'm moving. So here's what we've got for you this week. We begin, as I teased at the top of the show, with the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. This is the body created by Pope Francis in 2014, shortly after his election to the papacy, to be his primary sounding board and kind of kitchen cabinet on the issue of reform from the clerical sexual abuse scandals that have rocked the Catholic Church in recent decades. Now, to run this commission, Pope Francis appointed probably the single Catholic bishop in the world most identified with the reform cause on sex abuse. That would be Cardinal O'Malley of Boston, who ever since has been the sort of top man for the commission. Now, the thing about this commission is It has always been merely an advisory group. It doesn't actually have any authority to do anything except other than to issue recommendations to the Pope. So it has tended to make great efforts to try to stay out of specific scandals that arise. For instance, shortly after it was created, the sex abuse scandals in Chile exploded that involved the appointment of a bishop, Juan Manuel Barros, who was linked to that country's most notorious abuser, former priest Ferdinand Caradima. When the Pope went to Chile, there were huge protests and so forth and so on. Commission didn't really say anything. Or, for instance, when the scandals involving former cardinal and now former priest Theodore McCarrick in the United States erupted, once again, the Commission did not directly speak out on the grounds that its mandate did not involve getting involved in specific cases. However, under the pressure of events and the desires of victims themselves to see this commission play a more robust role in these kinds of affairs, of late, the commission, under O'Malley's leadership, has demonstrated a greater willingness to involve itself in specific cases. For instance, last October, after the case of Father Marko Rupnik, Slovenian ex-Jesuit, one of the most celebrated artists in contemporary Catholicism, who has done frescoes. His work involves the fusion of Eastern and Western Christian themes. He's done frescoes that are displayed in the Vatican's Redemptor Materus Chapel, in the famed Marian Shrine of Lourdes, and in various other venues around the world. It emerged that Rupnik had been accused of the serial sexual abuse, mostly of adult women, mostly of nuns, involving a community in Slovenia of which he was the kind of patron. After that scandal blew up, he was originally kicked out of the Jesuits after an investigation by the Jesuit order found that the allegations were highly credible. However, it then appeared for a while as if the Vatican itself wasn't inclined to do anything, because what had happened is Rupnik was incardinated into a diocese in Slovenia, saying, if the Jesuits don't want you, we'll take you. The leader of the center in Rome that he had founded, the artistic center in Rome called the Centro Aletti, that leader was received by Pope Francis while the Pope had never met with the alleged victims of Rupnik. And the Pope's own vicar of Rome kind of gave the Centro Aletti a clean bill of health, saying it promotes a positive spiritual environment. And so it kind of looked like everything was going to be swept under the rug. At that point, in October 2023, the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors under O'Malley stepped in and delivered a message to the Pope in the name of the members of the commission saying basically, no, you can't roll this way. You've got to take these accusations seriously. In the response to that, the Pope decided to waive the statute of limitations in church law and to authorize a Vatican investigation of Rupnik, which we think is still going on. I emphasize we think because they haven't told us anything. In classic Vatican fashion, we don't actually know what the status of this probe is, but nevertheless, there is every reason to believe that something continues to be underway. And that brings us to the present, where just a few days ago, the head of the Vatican's Dicastery for Communications, and I just want to pause for a moment and make clear who we're talking about. We're talking about the Vatican's PR expert, the guy who, more than anyone else, is supposed to be sensitive to public opinion, okay? This guy, an Italian layman by the name of Paolo Ruffini, veteran Italian journalist, was in Atlanta for a convention of the Catholic media in the United States, took some questions about how come images by Rupnik are still being displayed on the website, the Dicastery for Communications. And in response, Ruffini, in fairly antagonistic fashion, to be honest, made sort of three basic points. First, he said, hey, these are just allegations. Nothing has been proven, so who am I to judge, right? Number two, he said, well, you know what? These allegations don't involve minors. So, the suggestion there being, therefore, the logic is different. And number three, he said, removing images does not mean you're any closer to victims. And he defied anyone to prove the contrary. Now, those comments kind of went off like a bombshell because, Rupnik's accusers have been saying for months that they wanted his artwork removed and that the fact that, church entities would continue to promote it in a public fashion was deeply offensive to them. And so all this culminated in a June 26th letter from Cardinal O'Malley as head of the Commission for the Protection of Minors to all the heads of departments in the Vatican, basically saying you guys should stop using images by Rupnik. He said, look, yes, the presumption of innocence is important, but so is pastoral sensitivity to people who've suffered at the hands of church personnel. And the Holy See, the Vatican, cannot afford to look oblivious to the psychological suffering of victims. Now, you might think that was a reasonably obvious point. Not so much if you consider that the Dicastery for Communications that very day put up a new image by Rupnik on its website. But nevertheless, the point is, this was O'Malley and the Commission speaking out on behalf of victims. We'll see what happens in terms of policy from this point forward. But I think the bottom line here is that it marks a kind of important evolution in the mission of the Commission for Minors. At the beginning, it was simply a sounding board that wasn't going to speak out on controversial issues. Now it is becoming something like an ombudsman for the Vatican, that is, the Vatican's own in-house critic that will speak out publicly when the perception is that there have been failures to take abuse scandals seriously. Obviously, we'll continue to track this. All right, second up this week and related. Quiet milestone, because this statement from the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors by Cardinal O'Malley came out last Friday, which, coincidentally, was 24 hours before Saturday, which was Cardinal O'Malley's 80th birthday. And now, as we all know, the 80th birthday is a big deal for cardinals of the Catholic Church because it means they are no longer eligible to participate in a conclave, that is, the election of a pope. And in theory, although not necessarily in practice, it means they lose all of their Vatican assignments. So if they're the head of a Vatican department or if they're members of a Vatican department, theoretically, all of that ends when they turn 80. Now, let me be very clear that the fact that Sean O'Malley has turned 80 does not mean that his story personally is over. Number one, he remains the Archbishop of Boston, which, if you think about it, is a very interesting point because diocesan bishops have to submit their resignations when they turn 75. In O'Malley's case, that was 5 years ago. But, obviously, Pope Francis wants him to continue. There is no indication that anytime soon he is going to stop being the Archbishop of Boston. So, that part of his portfolio is still in place. And secondly, there is no necessary reason why his role as president of the Commission for the Protection of Minors has to end simply because he's turned 80, because the Pope can dispense from this requirement. The Pope could easily ask him to stay on, at least through the next plenary assembly of the Commission, at least through the Synod of Bishops in October, potentially beyond all of that. And Pope Francis has given no indication that he is done drawing upon the services and the expertise of Cardinal Sean O'Malley. That said, nevertheless, the fact he has turned 80 is a kind of important moment. It certainly means we are closer to the end of the Sean O'Malley story than we are the beginning. And while there is a great deal that could be said about Cardinal O'Malley at this point, the one point I would like to make is simply that I think he is the cardinal, the current member of the College of Cardinals, who most clearly incarnates and exemplifies the ethos of the religious order from which he comes. Cardinal Sean O'Malley is a Capuchin Franciscan. And I think he is to the cardinals today what Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini of Milan was in his day in the 80s and 90s. That is the perfect embodiment of his religious order. Cardinal Martini was a Jesuit, intellectual, aloof, ethereal, a maverick, right? A thorn in the side of the system. Cardinal O'Malley, on the other hand, is a vintage Capuchin. He is simple, humble, in some ways completely conventional. I mean, non-experimental, definitely not a maverick, but nevertheless, somebody whose defining trait is closeness to the people, right? Somebody who is not a kind of, does not operate according to the logic of an imperial court, but instead very much operates according to the logic of the street. In the 70s and 80s, when he was in Washington, he was an advocate for migrants and refugees, served a Hispanic cultural center in DC. He was part of protests against mistreatment. He was part of Ralph Abernathy's protests against racism. Then he went on to become the bishop of 3 dioceses in a row, okay, that had massive sexual abuse scandals. I'm talking about Fall River, Massachusetts, then Palm Beach, then the Archdiocese of Boston, and which became the Chernobyl of the American Catholic Church in 2002, 2003. Capuchins have always prided themselves on taking the toughest jobs the Catholic Church has to offer. That, ladies and gentlemen, is Sean O'Malley in a nutshell. Now look, he's been in power for around 3 decades now. Nobody who was in charge of anything that long has an unblemished record. There is a legitimate criticism to be made of many aspects of Sean O'Malley's record. But if you want to ask, has he been true to himself and his identity, which in his mind is fundamentally his identity as a Capuchin Franciscan? I don't know that anybody has lived up to his own expectations of himself, in a way, more than Cardinal Sean O'Malley. As I say, however, the O'Malley story is not finished, and we will keep our eyes on it here at Crux. All right, third up this week, jousting with the Germans. So, in the wake of the massive sexual abuse scandals in the German Catholic Church, the German bishops, in tandem with the most important lay body in Germany, the Central Committee of German Catholics, decided some years ago to launch what they called a Synodal Way, which basically was a kind of national consultation of the Catholic Church in Germany, bringing together laity, clergy, religious, bishops in a kind of broad conversation about the state of things and where they ought to go. Now, from the very beginning, there was great fear that, given the profile of the Catholic Church in Germany as one of the more progressive local churches anywhere in the Catholic world, there was fear as to where this might lead. Specifically, there was fear that it might lead to calls for, say, the ordination of women priests, for the blessing of same-sex unions, for married priests, for the election of bishops, and for a kind of, broad rethink of how power is distributed and exercised. And when I say that these were fears that some people had at the beginning, they were not irrational fears, because if you look at the results of the Synodal Way, they actually voted in favor of every one of the positions I just ticked off. Okay? So it ended with calls for reforms, for changes on all of these fronts, which of course has made it massively controversial around the Catholic world. But as it turns out, the real heart of the dispute isn't over content, like, same-sex unions or women priests. It's actually over what you might call control. That is, it's over governance and authority. Because another one of the recommendations of this Synodal Way was the creation of a new governing body for the Catholic Church in Germany, something that would be called a Synodal Committee, that would, in a sense, take the place of the Bishops' Conference. Only in this case, it would involve both laity and bishops together, making binding decisions on behalf of the Catholic Church in Germany. And in fact, if you look at the proposed statutes of this Synodal Committee, it actually would have allowed laity on their own, in some circumstances, to make binding decisions, because the membership of this committee would have allowed a 2/3 vote, which would have been decisive, to occur without the support of a single Catholic bishop. And, obviously, this proved to be enormously controversial. And from the beginning, the Vatican has tried to sort of rein this entire process in Most recently, this past Friday, a panel of senior Vatican potentates and the leadership of the German Bishops' Conference sat down for what amounts to the latest in a series of peace negotiations, an attempt to kind of reach a peace deal about all of this. A statement put out by the Vatican afterwards indicated that they had made clear, that is, the Vatican side had made clear, that although nothing is stopping the German church from creating some new body, that body cannot take the place of the Bishops' Conference, nor can it be above the Bishops' Conference, that the Bishops' Conference is recognized by church law as the governing authority of the Catholic Church in Germany, and that no new institution can supplant or usurp or hijack that rule. And the German bishops they made somewhat non-committal noises after all of this. On the one hand, saying, yes, we have, of course, heard what the Vatican had to say, didn't necessarily commit to abiding by it. We're going to have to see how all of this plays out. But I think the interesting point is this, that all of this, of course, is happening on the cusp of the concluding act of Pope Francis's own Synod of Bishops on Synodality, which is set, the curtain comes up on that in October here in Rome. And in some ways, the Germans are providing a very handy-dandy, user-friendly reminder to opponents of the synodal process of what the nightmare scenario is about where all of this might lead. I mean, in other words, whether they realize it or not, in some ways, the best friends of the opponents of the Synod on Synodality are, in fact, the Germans, because they are confirming the worst fears that more conservative or traditional Catholics might have. As ever at Crux, we will continue to track how these negotiations play out. At the moment, I think what I would say is the story is the Vatican signals a yellow light. The Germans still have their foot on the gas. We'll see whether they shift to the brake as things unfold. All right, fourth up this week, a tut-tut for tattoos. So return with me now to those heady days of 2018, when Pope Francis had a session, as he often does with Catholic youth, and in the middle of this session, the subject of tattoos arose. It arose because the Pope himself brought it up, and he said, I noticed that many of you have tattoos. Now let me say this about tattoos. I think the church should not be afraid of it. The church should never be afraid of youth. Never, 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 he said. And in fact, he counseled Catholic priests to pay careful attention to the tattoos that young people sport, because he said there is often a great deal to be learned from them. We can learn something about the character, the concerns, the personality, the individuality of the young person who is wearing these tattoos. So we should engage tattoo culture, not oppose it, right? And he cited the example, for instance, of Ethiopian Christians who have had tattoos and so forth and so on. It was kind of a, if you like, a tribute, a papal tribute to tattoos. All right, that, however, was 2018. Now, flash forward to June 29th, 2024, in other words, this past Saturday, the Vatican issued two new sets of statutes, one governing employees of the Fabbrica di San Pietro, that is the administration of St. Peter's Basilica, the other governing the chapter of St. Peter's Basilica, that is a body of retired clergy who kind of participate in the liturgical and sacramental and pastoral life of the Basilica. And probably the most noted codicil of these new rules for employees of St. Peter's Basilica was a ban on having visible tattoos. That is, tattoos you can see when they're wearing the clothes that they have on for work. And also a ban on visible piercings. So ditto, any piercing you can see when they're at work. Now, these provisions were part of a broader cluster of new rules, which also banned cohabitation among employees of the Basilica, basically saying that if you're going to live together, you have to be married in the church and you have to have a certificate of Catholic marriage, indicating that that's actually happened. You have to be both baptized and confirmed. You have to have a letter from your local pastor indicating you are a Catholic in good standing in your parish. You have to promise to observe Catholic faith and morals, and you have to swear a loyalty oath in front of the superiors of the basilica or the specific department in which you work. So, all of this, I suppose, an attempt to promote what you might consider a kind of dress code for employees of the basilica, both a literal dress code, but also a metaphorical one, indicating you have to be dressed not only, without tattoos and piercings, but you have to be dressed in the morality and the faith of the Catholic Church. Now, there were more serious things in these rule changes, some of them having to do with promoting secrecy and confidentiality, that is trying to attack the culture of leaks that has beset the Vatican in recent years. Some of it also having to do with the reform of this cathedral chapter, that is, this 30-some retired clergy who traditionally have been members of the chapter of the Basilica of St. Peter, which is a gig that kind of gives them great privileges. Usually it comes with an apartment, usually it comes with a stipend, plus they get paid fees for specific services like hearing confessions and saying masses and so on. And this is an effort to kind of clamp down on some of that. Pope Francis has said that once these clergy turn 80, they become merely honorary members of the chapter, so they can't get stipends anymore. And plus, if you haven't shown up for at least a year, you can't get stipends anymore either. So this is like an effort to correct against absenteeism. Basically, the idea is it's a specific application of the Pope's broader kind of bone to pick with clericalism. All right? But in other words, I guess the point is this: Pope Francis may believe that we have nothing to fear from tattoos if you are at the beach, but if you come into the basilica, do not expect anybody who's on the Vatican dime to be sporting some ink, at least ink that you can see. All right, we end up this week with a missionary moment. There is a report currently on the Crux website, authored by our superstar blockbuster Vatican correspondent, my wife, Elise Ann Allen, regarding the Missionaries of Charity. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, of course, is arguably one of the 2 or 3 or 4 most beloved Catholic personalities of the 20th century. Her Missionaries of Charity sisters serve all around the world and are regarded as moral and spiritual heroes for their service to the poorest of the poor. And nothing in our report challenges any of that. However, what it does suggest is that in addition to all of that, there is also a persistent pattern of former members of the Missionaries of Charity coming out reporting concerns about an internal climate of abuse. Not simply sexual abuse, perhaps not even primarily sexual abuse, although that's included, but also abuses of conscience, abuses of authority, kind of spiritual abuses, so forth and so on. And in a pattern that is, of course, wearily familiar from other chapters of the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, their experience has been that when they have come forward to try to report these abuses, they have either been ignored or politely or not so politely told to go away, both by authorities inside the community and also by other authorities in the church, including in the Vatican. Let me make clear that there are almost 6,000 missionaries of charity sisters in the world. Presumably, the vast majority of them have never abused anybody. But let us also make clear that these reports we are talking about stem from a considerable number of former members, and they are spread over a considerable period of time, some of them decades ago, some of them quite recent. It points to a pattern that no one can afford simply to ignore. And we will, of course, at Crux be tracking what the response of authorities to these reports are now that they have been made public in a kind of comprehensive and, I would suggest, utterly professional fashion. All right. As ever, all of these stories can be found on the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com. Again, cruxnow.com, your one-stop shopping for the very best in smart, wired, independent Catholic journalism. We will be here next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, have a fantastic week.